John, I'm really setting up things badly. I asked you to come here because I knew you were doing some work with some of the people who are innovating. And let's say about when it comes to innovation, it doesn't go linearly. It tends to grow in unexpected directions. So you're in an interesting area of just what might happen. And I'm asking you to predict the future, which maybe you can or can't. But tell us what you know about what you've seen in the world of drone planting, please. And welcome to John Ennis from the UBC Forestry Department, please. Warm welcome.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Back again. I would never be invited again after the last time I spoke to you, because I think I annoyed a lot of people. So I thought, well, did it once, let's do it again. Drones can plant trees 150 times faster than planting by hand and up to 10 times cheaper. So you might as well, all of you, pack up your bags, go home, because there's not going to be any tree planters in the future.
You're here. Wait a minute, that's the wrong message.
No one's moving. So you don't believe me. Okay, well, that's just as well, because this is one of the claims that's made by one of the drone companies, and I think it's total BS, quite honestly. What I want to talk about today really is, we will look at the question, will aerial planting replace tree planters? The guys and girls on the ground. We'll look at the different options. We'll look at some of the claims that are being made by the advocates, and it's just like a lot of new technologies. Don't know how many of you were around when people started talking about satellite imagery. It's going to tell us everything we need to know about forests and forestry and the rate of deforestation and everything else. And then it turns out, well, it takes an entire year to analyze a single image in the early days for one of the Landsat images. It wasn't going to work, but the claims were made. And then finally, we'll talk about where I think we currently are and where we are going. We've used the same technology for at least 4,000 years. People. Okay, the spades may have changed a little bit, the clothing may have changed, your boots may have changed, but the basic person, I guess maybe now is a bit taller than they used to be. But apart from that, people haven't changed very much. We have seen the introduction of attempts to change the way trees are planted. So there are tree planting machines that works well if you're in a nice agricultural field, in a seed orchard or somewhere like that, or a nursery. It doesn't work very well in a cut block in the middle of the forest. However, there are technologies that are being used on the ground to plant trees. This is quite a cool machine that will actually do the scarification, put in some fertilizer, put in a seedling, and you're off. Bit different from the standard tree planter. The idea of actually planting from the air has been around for a while. And I met someone who actually said, well, yes, I had to do some work out at UBC Research Forest under a guy called Jack Walters. You remember, someone knows it. Yeah, that's them. So the idea was you could create basically some sort of a bullet that you could drop from the air, and it would go into the soil. It would basically decompose, leaving the seedling to grow. And I've seen these being used firstly at UBC, then there was an idea they would be used in the desert in Europe. There was a company established to try and do that. It, as far as I know, went nowhere. It was Jeff Burley and a few others from the Oxford Forestry Institute that were running it. It may have gone nowhere because planting trees in the desert is actually quite difficult, particularly if you're dropping them from plains and it's big stony soil. Nature's had a go at doing this. I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but in nature, mangroves, some species of mangroves do it. And so mangroves like this are established by aerial planting. And what they have are these hypocotyls, they're called, that will drop into the ground, and you can see it there, and take root. Very neat, it would seem. But actually, when I thought, this is really interesting, I wonder how often it works. And I tried and tried and tried, and they all just landed like that. This is something that took about 200 million years of evolution. They've got a few working. They're dropping them from about a meter, meter and a half into mud. That makes a huge difference, obviously. If you try dropping these onto a slash pile, it's not going to go through the slash pile. So that's actually one of the problems that we have with our drones. So what are the alternatives? There's been aerial broadcasting of seeds done for a long time in places like Australia. I'm not sure if it was ever done here. It may have been done before my time, probably. But it was certainly still being practiced in parts of Australia. Burn off the surface, bring in either a small plane or a helicopter, broadcast eucalyptus seeds, and you get wonderful regeneration. The drone planting is done in various different ways. You could simply drop seed. And there are certain drones that, that will go out and they'll just drop seed and hope for the best. There are pelletized seeds, obviously much bulkier, and takes a lot more drones to actually plant them. There are pelletized germinated seeds. So a seed may not be germinated, or it may be germinated. And then the most recent development, I think, is the firing of these pellets. So instead of just dropping them on the surface, they're being fired into the ground, and according to the companies, they either go 6 inches into the ground, or they may go just a little bit into the ground, or whatever. It depends on what you believe. From what I've seen, I would need a very special soil to get a pellet 6 feet into the ground, or six inches into the ground, not feet. I should go metric one day, I suppose, but never mind. So a quick round of who's doing what. We have XAG Australia. They're an agricultural company. They've done a lot of work with basically turnip fields or whatever. They are now getting into using drones for forest or bush restoration. They're using unmanned vehicles, both aerial and ground vehicles. This is an example of one of their ground vehicles. But they're also using... Whoa, not sure what happened there.
You're giving away the ending.
Yeah. They're also using drones. This is one that just scatters seed. It's not actually firing the seed. They're not pelletized. They use a 12-species seed mix. They're planting it in a wetland area in this particular case. But there are lots of examples like this. And you can see there, they've just got a jug of seed they're pouring into a hopper. And it will just go out and do essentially what the same thing as planes and helicopters were doing. A slightly more complex one. It's the one they're using now after bushfires. That hopper has a capacity of 40,000 seeds. It can go out, so seeds a load, I mistyped that, not a day. So they can go out, they can scatter the seed over fairly large areas fairly easily. That's an example of the sort of site that would be used for that type of broadcast seeding. This is in Australia, in Victoria, in Gippsland. And you can see there, they've actually burnt the site. There's actually a very receptive soil cover now for seed to be scattered on. There are other companies operating. Aerocoup is an example of one. They have a drone called Drone Coria. It is claimed it carries up to 10 kilos of seed. And they can, according to their website, in a 10-minute flight, they can cover a hectare and distribute up to 500,000 seeds in 10 minutes. I don't believe it, quite honestly. You can see it's actually a very basic design. You can make this yourself. It's open source. If you happen to have the right equipment, it's made of plywood. And I just don't believe this one is what it's claiming. Drone Seed, company you may be familiar with. They actually employ planters as well as drones. They're based in Seattle and they're used by the Forest Enhancement Society here. Why we're employing American companies rather than Canadian companies, decision for government, I guess. They have not pellets, they have vessels that they drop. And I've just put a quotation there from their advertising. Successful reforestation means getting the right seed to the right place at the right time. Our drones use LiDAR and aerial imagery, as do a lot of them now. They are going into primarily post-wildfire landscapes. They are identifying the areas that need to be reseeded using the LiDAR and the aerial imagery. They are analyzing soil quality, water runoff, sun exposure, presumably not with drones, to map out exactly what species should go where, and then determining the best planting patterns. Sounds great. I haven't actually seen their operation. I don't know if any of you have. Okay.
We work with both drone seed and flash forest.
Right.
I mean, we have NDAs.
Hold,
Yeah.
Can you rewind the tape back, please?
We work with drone seed and flash forest, and we have non-disclosure agreements with both of them. But I mean, it's a lot of seed being used to germinate a very few seedlings.
Yeah, this is actually one of the problems I had preparing this presentation. I have an NDA as well, and everything is secret. And they couldn't let me allow. They sent me a presentation, said you can use all of this, and then each one the slide said do not use, copyright, confidential. But I will tell you as much as I can, and probably a little more than I should. Other companies, there's Biocarbon Engineering. They are a UK company. They actually had the bright idea of actually working in mangroves. It is easier to work in mangroves because you have a perfect surface there, provided you get your tide tables right. If you get your tide tables wrong, you're going to be dropping in water, which would be a bit of a mistake. Dendra Systems, it evolved from biocarbon. They are using mixtures. They claim that in just a few hours, they can spread millions of seeds. Those millions of seeds will generate roughly 15,000 trees, so they claim. So that gives you an idea of the potential losses involved. They reckon they can seed up to 60 hectares a day and carry 700 kilos of seed in a daily payload. They are primarily operating in Australia. They've also got some operations in Europe. Interestingly, they claim that they will plant 500 billion trees by 2060. It's a lot of trees. It's an example of one of their drones. This one is actually firing a seed pod as opposed to just broadcasting seed. The planting rate is 120 seed pods a minute to a second. That's pretty standard amongst the drones at the moment. The seeds they are using are already germinated, compared with some of the other companies where they are not using germinated seeds. They're using pressurized air for the actual firing. Airseed Technologies, another company, they're Australian. They use typical Australian language. They're going to give Mother Nature a kick up the bum. They emphasize how efficient they are at doing post-planting surveys. They will go in afterwards. They will make sure that every seed that they dropped has germinated somehow. It's actually not too difficult to do it with pellets. It's a lot more difficult to do it with seed. However, they get a pretty good idea of where has been successful, and it's very easy to go back. It's one of the advantages of the drones. They have an interesting claim. They're going to plant 100 million trees by 2024. They better start now because they haven't started yet. So they've got a lot of trees to plant, which I'll come back to that in a minute, that issue. They're planting in Australia, so it's probably on state land. And finally, Flash Forest. It's the company I'm associated with, and I say it's a very vague association. It's not like I'm an employee or anything with them. They are claiming that they will have 1 billion in the ground by 2028. They also claim that they are underway as of yesterday, that they will succeed in that. 1 billion trees. I think the first thing I would say when we're looking at all these claims is we need to make sure that we are actually comparing the same thing. Are you planting trees? Are you planting seeds? Are you scattering seeds? Are you planting seedlings, saplings? What are you actually doing? Having this conversation with John earlier, how many people here are tree planters? There's a tree that's been planted. I think most people are seedling planters, or sapling planters maybe, or seed planters. But anyway, there's a lot of these claims about, we're going to plant all these trees. If we're actually making comparisons, we do need to know, are we dealing with germinated seeds? Are they encased in some sort of a medium? Are they being dropped onto the surface, or are they being embedded or even buried in the soil? How well are they matched to the site? It's really important to remember that planting a seed does not equal having a tree. And yet most of those claims are based on those numbers. We have 100 million seeds that we're going to distribute, or pellets. That's going to be exactly what we've got in terms of a forest. And obviously that does not make sense, because you do have mortality, and it's quite significant when you're dealing with seeds and even germinated seeds. So comparisons are really difficult. I just put that slide in the man who planted trees, because when I was writing this, it reminded me of the story of the Frenchman walking around dropping acorns everywhere. So where is flash forest at? I think a lot of the companies could be saying more or less the same about any of the drone companies at the moment. They're still relatively small scale. Flash forest planted about 100 hectares in 2022. It's going to be 600 hectares under contract so far for 2023. They're primarily operating here in BC, but they are also operating in Alberta and Ontario. They've been trying different types of site. It's still fairly experimental. So they've been trying in post-burn, post-harvest, and grassy, so afforestation sites. The greatest success has been in post-burn, the least success in post-harvest. In fact, drones do not work well, generally, if there's a lot of slash on the ground. Tree planters are far better in those areas. So the greatest success has been in the post-burn, and that's where they're going to be concentrating in the future. The more recent it is, the better, and the more severe the burn is, the better. So high severity 4 to 6 class burns are ideal planting sites for the drones. The success also varies tremendously depending on the timing, and Flash Forest was planting too late for a couple of years. It's now moved its operations much earlier in the season, but it does depend on whether or not there's going to be summer rainfall. Everyone understands that, except some of the engineers running drones, it seems. So really, it's been successful in areas where you have reasonably high summer precipitation. And essentially, if you're down below about 275 millimeters mean summer precipitation, you're going to have a low success rate, unless you have an unusually wet summer. So grassy afforestation, the reason it doesn't work there, competition with the grass. And so the best way to deal with that is to turn it over. So a site in Australia. But if you're turning it over, you've got people on the ground. So why do you need drones? You use tree planters instead. In this case, they actually use machines. Flash Forest is a company that uses pellets. They collect significant amounts of seed, so it was 150 kilograms, 2022. They're anticipating collecting about 200 kilograms of seed this year. The seeds are encased in a mixture. I'm not allowed to tell you exactly what's in that mixture. None of the companies will tell you. No one tells you what their secret sauce is, whether it's a drone company or anyone else. But it is actually quite an interesting mix. I can say that. It contains fertilizer, as you'd expect, but it also contains moisture-holding material that will actually absorb moisture and open up the pellet as soon as it becomes wet. It will retain that moisture. There are also mycorrhizae involved. And there's been quite a bit of work going on to work out which mycorrhizae would be the best to include and how do you do that. So it's a secret sauce, but the germination rate is quite high. Again, I can't tell you the exact numbers. It'll come out. You'll get it. I'm not going to say it because this has been recorded, but you should be able to work it out. Okay, the drones are constantly improving. They tend to be, there's competition between the companies, and so they don't like telling everyone exactly what they're doing or how they're changing. But what we've seen is the capacity increasing progressively. So 80 pods to 1,500 pods in about 3 years, that increase. There's 1 seed per pod. 2023 capacity of the drones that Flash Forest are using is going to be much higher. And by 2024, it's going to have increased by about 1,000% on the current 1,500. I'm going to tell you how many, but work it out. Planting rate, 2022, round about 100,000 seed pods per day. That's what the company was achieving. They are anticipating a major increase in that figure this year. It does depend on how many drones are operational and how many teams are operating. The drones themselves are very variable. This is a very simple early one used for reconnaissance. It was used for photography. Nowadays, the drones are carrying LiDAR. So things have changed dramatically. An early planting drone, you can see actually one of the pods being dropped out of this. This had a capacity of 80 pods, and it would fly around, be about 10 minutes, come back. And these pods it's a circular drum that's revolving, and that's how the pods are coming out on a fairly regular basis. Totally different today, but that's the system that initially started. And you can see there, again, that round drum. This is a more advanced one. It's actually a prototype. This is one of the ones that was firing out of it. Not sure if you can, I don't think there's a pointer here, but the tube that you can see vertical in between the landing stands, that's where they were being fired from. You can see the air canister immediately above that. And in this particular one, the pods were coming down that tube, because I said this is an experimental prototype. They're much more sophisticated now, but essentially they can fire the pellets down into the ground with sufficient velocity to embed them. So I haven't got an example of the drones that they're using this year because they're not operational yet, obviously. What they are anticipating this year is that 3 operators will be able to plant 1 million pods a day, around about 44 hectares a day. So that's the anticipated rate. I think that answers your question of how many tree planters do you need to change the batteries. There's teams of 3 people that are working. The pods used by Flash Forest are being fired into the ground. The ideal depth is actually only half a pod depth. So they can succeed in getting that most times. It's actually much more difficult to drive it down any further, just because these are quite high up. They're flying generally above the canopy level. And so you'd need huge velocity to get into the ground. If you fired it with that velocity, chances are you're going to break up the seed pod. So you're going to have that balance between the velocity that you're going to be using. That's going to change probably because in the future, the drones are going to be flying much lower because they've got avoidance mechanisms being built into them. Obstacle avoidance. Nowadays, the most recent drones, they can record the location of every pod that's fired. And you can that's geolocated. So you can do a survey following year, go back to exactly the same sites to see whether or not there's been any germination success. Germination rates are very variable. Depends on the species, depends on the bioclimatic zone, mean summer precipitation, the meteorology during the summer that it was planted, depends on the pod type, how it's being fired, what the ground conditions were like on the day that it was being fired. the embedding rate. So a whole lot of different variables, as you would expect, are involved. Survival, generally assess the following 2 years. So they will go back not just the following summer, but the summer afterwards. And the goal is to have 20% of the pods generating a seedling. So you're basically wasting 4 out of every 5, but the cost of production is so low that they can do that. Kind of different from regular tree planting. The company will then do top-up flights, so they will go in, and if there's been low success rates, they can be replanted, and they can do that relatively easily and relatively cheaply. It's much more expensive if you're using planters. Currently, the drones are flying relatively high. They're above the canopy. The new drones will have obstacle avoidance systems, and so they can actually fly much lower. So they can fly in and around trees, for example. As opposed to right now, they don't have that. I did actually ask them, I said, well, I thought I had a vacuum cleaner that could avoid obstacles. So how come your drones can't? And then I actually did a little bit of research in the vacuum cleaner, and it's called soft touch technology. So it touches something, and that's how it senses that it's hit or reached an obstacle. That doesn't work for drones. As you can imagine, it's like a helicopter. It doesn't do it that way either. If it were to touch something, it would end up on the ground. So the big question, will drones replace tree planters? It's obvious from our experience that drones are less effective at replanting cut blocks, particularly if they're covered in logging debris. It just doesn't work. The success rate is minimal. The drones are currently less precise with microsites than tree planters. So you can work in a seedling in amongst debris much more easily if you're on the ground and you've got a spade than if you're up in the air. The drones are working with seeds, generally, not seedlings. So there's a much higher failure rate. I was talking to Dirk Brinkman. I tried to get from him exactly what is the survival rate of seedlings planted by tree planters.
Over 85%.
He reckoned 90. I thought, but he was kind of said, well, it does vary a little bit. I said, well, of course it varies, yeah. You're going to have years that you have much lower. You're going to have years you might have close to 95 or even better. But I would expect that because you're dealing with a 2 or 3 year old seedling very often. And so it's going to be well established. If you're dealing with just a seed on the ground, you've got so many different factors until you get that first 3 years. And finally, drones, I just thought I'd throw this in. They're not so good at telling stories. Tree planters are very good at telling stories, but you may not be aware of Chat GPT. That could change things. Could change things dramatically. Siri, tell me a story. And it might well do so. And drones aren't very good in that sort of a situation. They're not yet precise enough to drop the seed pods down the tree shelters. So there's still going to be a lot of room for tree planters. And I think the optimum is going to be combinations of the two. So, well, there we go. Conclusions. Drones, less effective than tree planters when we're dealing with cut blocks. Less precise with microsites. Work best with seeds. They're not very good with seedlings yet. In fact, I don't know of any good technology with seedlings other than those bombs that we were talking about earlier. But they were quite heavy and you'd need pretty heavy-duty drone to lift them. But they can. They're capable of that. And you've seen in Ukraine what drones can do nowadays. The drones are significantly cheaper and faster, and they can do replanting, replacement planting relatively easily. You just need, a team will go out and deal with it. But the mortality rates are much higher. The biggest advantage that I see is that drones can work in areas where tree planters might have problems. Could be very steep slopes, It could be very high bug areas, although the operators of the drones still have to be there as well. But they might be a bit more protected than an average tree planter. They can work in sites where there could be problems with health issues. And I was just looking at one of the WorkSafe BC documents about working in fire areas where there's a lot of ash. So tree drones might be better in that sort of situation. And I know in northern Alberta, there are sites where the Alberta government has been discouraging tree planters from operating, and drones are operating instead in those areas quite successfully. So you're going to be here for a while, I think. Tree planters have been around 4,000 years. They're going to be around for at least another 1,000 years, I suspect. Drones, however, are catching up. The technology is catching up. The use of artificial intelligence, I think, is going to offer lots of new potential and new things. Who thought or who would have known that a drone could carry LiDAR? You know, it's pretty novel concept. And in fact, the whole concept of LiDAR is fairly novel compared, when I did forestry, it's a long time ago, there was no such thing as LiDAR. In fact, I doubt if there was when you were around, John. So these technologies are getting better, and they are now being merged with the physical technologies, the engineering, the drones, for example. I think the pellets and the germination success rates will only go up. We'll get better and better at working those out. However, there will still be room for tree planters. I'll stop there.
That was a qualified round of applause.
Well, you didn't throw me out.
No. Okay, it was great to see pictures of Jack Walders. He took me under his wing back at the research forest. I actually have a little plastic bullet that I've just kept as a souvenir, because in his day, he wanted to, the joke was he was going to replace us with tanks. And the counter to that was, you can't make a tank that stupid. So that was self-effacing sort of remarks. Jordan, you have a question from our internet friends.
Oh, no, this question's from me. It's an observation and it's a question. First, an observation, and I think rightfully so, the emphasis on numbers, bigger, millions, this, and certainly this is connected to the vast scale of climate change and the need for reforestation. But at the same time, it does come across like a technology war, selling us a camera with more megapixels and more RAM, and that is the way of marketing electronics in today's society. What I would like to know is if any of these drones are making advances or emphasizing the quality of the forest and the quality of the seedling, and how they can microsite. When a person puts a tree in the ground, they use their fingers, they use all of their senses to assess the composition of the soil. We actually want it close to an obstacle. We don't avoid the obstacles, we're actually drawn to them. We want to be on the southeastern exposure, or sometimes the north, or sometimes the slope slide. And are there any advances being made to attend to these subtleties in finding the exact best place for that seedling so it can become the best possible tree? And are any of these things being prioritized by any of the drone companies that you've identified?
Well, firstly, in terms of the variety of species that are being planted, that is being emphasized by a couple of companies. And they're saying, well, we can generate mixes. And so it's not like we're going out and planting clonal stock throughout a forest. In terms of the microsite, I don't think they're anywhere close to where you were talking about yet. The drone seeds advertising says that it takes into account a lot of the factors, but they would have to be on the ground to actually get that information. And I suspect they're not going out and checking every single microsite that a drone then comes across. I know they're not, because it would simply be impossible. But what they're doing is looking at the overall soil type in an area and then saying, okay, the following mix of species would be the most appropriate. We're not at the stage of being able to get right down into those micro site really specifics that a person on the ground can do. As I said, I wouldn't rule that out as being impossible, particularly the way artificial intelligence is allowing us to be so much more, or to allowing machines to essentially think more than they currently have done in the past. I'm being anthropomorphic, I know, but I couldn't think of a better word.
Thanks, John. I still think that's planters 1, zone 0, just in terms of keeping score on this.
Hi. So assuming that 4/5 of the seeds are going to die, I presume there's no even spacing in that. So there's going to be huge problems with thinning and other problems that are created there. Plus, my bigger question is going to be, are we not already in a bit of a crisis over seed volumes that are available? So if we're willing to throw 4/5 of all the seeds available into the garbage, like how are we getting all these seeds? And there's already a lot of competition to have enough seeds.
Okay, I think there's several different parts to that question. And I think they're also very interesting, because when you're looking at what tree planters are putting in the ground, it is improved stock very often. It's not always, but very often. You're not going to have that with the seed, generally. I guess you could do if it's collected specifically from a seed orchard. You know exactly what you're collecting. Flash forest is not collecting that type of seed. They're going into the wild forest, so to speak, and collecting. And I think most of the other drone companies are doing that. I don't know of any that are. Is Tony Blaskovitz? I think I just went off. I think they're planting improved stock. I think what you're talking about in terms of the availability of seed is for basically seed of known quality and origin, whereas they're not using that. I think the drones what the drones are doing at the moment, and a lot of the seed that they're using is basically just trying to get forest cover back into certain areas. It's not like you're going in planting with a view to harvesting that crop 60 years from now. It's more reestablishing a forest cover. And then the need to thin is not quite so dramatic as it would be if it was high value timber that you're basically going after a specific stocking density.
Makes sense, but based on those volumes, that's a crazy amount of seed that still needs to be planted.
Yeah. As I said, I know Flash Forests are collecting 200 kilos this year. They collected 150 kilos of seed last year. And it's 200 this year. I'm not sure where they're doing it or how they're doing it. But it's the impression I've received is that there is no problem with seed supply. Maybe that's wrong.
Yeah. So I have a follow-up question on that. Is in BC, because we've got mountains and biogeographic areas, that our seed is not transferable all over the province. We have to seed zones, and it's follow up to what she was saying. We've got areas where we have lack of seed, and like you said, A-class seed's expensive. But I get the indication when you're talking that the idea is they're going to use the same seed everywhere. That you can't do that. You're going to have to collect the seed, and it's going to be relatively expensive to line the seed up with the area, and you wouldn't want to waste 80% of your seed.
They're certainly, all the drone companies have to follow the seed transfer rules and guidelines and everything else. So they will be collecting locally or within the catchment, well, not the catchment, the seed collection area. Those rules are changing. I heard a presentation from Nora White. I think she was here earlier. She was not, yeah. No, I don't know. Anyway, last week there was a presentation where we were told that, the seed rules have all been changed in BC. And then Dirk Brinkman said, well, no one's actually following them. No one's taking advantage of it. Maybe he's wrong. I don't know. Well, obviously he must be wrong. You're saying he is. It is an issue. I think we need to make sure that all the companies that are operating, whether it be tree planters or drones, are collecting and following the seed rules. But I know, just come back to that wastage issue. Trees produce vast volumes of seed. You just need one seed to replace one tree.
But it costs a lot of money to collect the seed. You got to dry it into the seed center. There's capacity at the seed center. How many?
Hey, Mike. Here's the seedy guy.
We have a man who knows about seeds here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, John. Brian Barber. Yeah. We're just cranking through some of the numbers there. So 1 million seed pods a day covering 44 hectares. That's 22,727 seeds per hectare. And then if you were to get 20% survival, you'd get about 4,000 stems per hectare. Okay?
Yep.
If you're planting what? 12,000 stems per hectare, right? Huh? 1,200. Did I say 12? Yeah, 12. Sorry, I meant 1,200 stems per hectare. And that would require about 10 grams of seed, of orchard seed, to grow that 1,200. We get 120 seedlings per gram of seed. I'm talking pine. Sorry, this example is all lodgepole pine. And so to reforest a hectare planting with improved seed costs you 10 grams at the select seeds price. So it would be about $83 per hectare for the seed cost. Doing some quick math, those 22,000 seed pods per hectare would require about 113 grams of seed. And let's assume that the collection cost is half of that of an orchard, so say $4,000 a kilogram or $4 per gram. Sorry, $4,000 per kilogram or $4 per gram. It would cost you about $452, I believe, in seed price to just for the drone. So you have $452 per hectare for the seed cost, the flash seeds, seed cost, plus whatever the drone costs are, compared to $1,200 per hectare for planting. Those numbers sound about right? I mean, in terms of, I think I've got the math right, but we're looking at about half the cost for flash seed, if you can get good quality seed, the right seed on the right site. But then you've got to add your drone costs in there too. So it's going to be a numbers game, really. And yes, you wouldn't be wanting to deploy expensive seed using drone seed, but on those areas where it's quite marginal and people may be relying on natural regen after like a large area, maybe this is a good opportunity to reforest those areas that wouldn't otherwise be reseeded.
So if I got that right, the drones are half the price maybe of what?
Well, it'll depending on what the drone costs are per hectare.
Okay.
But I was just calculating the seed price.
Yeah, you need to factor in the tree planter costs as well. If you're,
I have, that's the 1,200. Yeah, it's let's say $1 a tree, and that's all in, right? Yeah. That's planting costs, nursery costs, seed costs.
Well, of course, you're not allowed to talk about this because they're going to.
I'm not. I do know. I do have some numbers, but I'm not allowed to do it. Which is. But you're pretty well right. Your calculations are pretty close.
Okay. We have maybe time for one more question. And Jordan, I see your arm up there.
I just wanted to point out what I felt to be a little bit of a contradiction in what's being claimed by the drone technologies, or at least what's being observed. much of the limitation seems to be that under certain conditions, they're not practical, slash and these things. But at the same time, later it was claimed that this will prevent planters from having to go into dangerous places, such as things that are very steep and slashy. So I look at the history of, and John, you and I discussed this briefly, but I'm wondering if you can comment on those claims, because we look at the history of the logging industry and how mechanized harvesting is now done in all of the flat areas, and the hand fallers are now on the steep slopes and they're getting crushed by timber and falling off rocks. It's very dangerous. And I personally look at the advance of drone technology as it's not creating a new risk, but it may be concentrating it for humans in select areas where drones are not able to go. And I'd just like to explore those claims a little deeper if possible.
Okay. The optimum site for drones that I think most of the companies would agree with now are post-fire sites, not post-harvesting sites. If you're on a steep slope, and it's got a covered in slash, it's just going to have the same problem as a flat site covered in slash. You just can't fire the pellets through it effectively. If there's mineral soil exposed, then they can actually work with that. But if there's slash covering it, it's not going to work at all.
So this could be, I think, an example of a forestry site where there could be both a safety and a production bonus. I would look at maybe a burnt steep valley where there's been something like the Ilaho Valley type thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, we're near the end of this conversation. Before the audience does really get mad at you, thinking that you're actually here to advocate for drones. Sorry, I did a bit myself. I thought that was very informative. It covered the topic well. It could still surprise us. Mm-hmm. And let's face it, they've moved a long ways from where they were in your original slides, where they were, and from Jack Walder's tank and so on. So who's underestimate them? But I don't think I'll be advising people to turn in their shovels too soon at all, by the looks of it. Okay. It's a great presentation and a good coverage of the topic too, John. Much appreciated.